There is a story the Visayan people of the Philippine Islands have been telling for longer than any written record can reach. It begins, as the oldest stories always do, not with a human being, but with the world itself, with the sea and the sky in their earliest relationship, before the terms of that relationship had been fully negotiated, before the boundaries between what belonged to the water and what belonged to the light had been properly drawn. It begins in a time when the sky held not one moon, but seven. 7 moons, each full and bright and enormous, rising together over the Philippine Sea, flooding the islands and the water between them with a light so complete that darkness, as we now understand it, did not exist in the same way. The night was not night. It was a second kind of day, softer, silver-edged, but luminous and generous and unbroken. Into that world rose the Bakunawa. Say the name, and you feel immediately that it belongs to something ancient. Bakunawa. It moves in the mouth with a particular weight. The opening syllable broad and grounded, the middle rising, the ending that trails like something descending back beneath a surface. In the languages of the Visayan peoples, the word carries within it the sense of a great serpent, a creature of the sea, something that moves between the world below the water and the world above it, with an ease that no ordinary creature possesses. It is not borrowed from anywhere. It does not feel translated. It feels original, the way only the oldest names feel original, as though the thing named it itself simply by existing, and the people who encountered it had no choice but to call it what it was. The Bakunawa was a serpent of incomprehensible size, not merely large in the way that the largest creatures of the natural world are large, but large in the way that mythological truth requires. Large enough to be felt rather than measured. Large enough that its rising from the ocean changed the quality of the sky. Large enough that when it opened its mouth toward the heavens, the mouth was not a feature of the creature, but a feature of the horizon. It lived in the deepest water. It had always lived in the deepest water. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. And for a time, in the earliest age of the world, it was content. What disturbed that contentment was the light. The 7 moons, in their collective brilliance, poured their silver down onto the Philippine Sea without rest, and the sea, the Bakunawa's home, the Bakunawa's world, was never dark, never private, never fully its own. And so the great serpent rose. Not in anger exactly, though the traditions differ on the precise quality of its motivation. It rose the way appetite rises, not chosen, not reasoned, but simply arriving, as inevitable as tide. It opened its vast mouth, and it swallowed a moon. And then, because one was not enough, it swallowed another, and another. The people on the islands watched the moons disappear one by one, and understood, with the particular clarity that crisis produces, that something had to be done. The Bakunawa could not be fought. Nothing human was ever going to matter to something of that scale. But it could, perhaps, be distracted, be confused, be persuaded, through sound and motion and the collective insistence of human presence, to pause in its feeding and turn its attention elsewhere long enough for the remaining moons, or the one surviving moon, to escape back below the horizon and out of reach. And so they made noise, tremendous, sustained, deliberate noise. They beat their pots and their drums. They raised their voices together, the entire community, in a sound that was not quite music and not quite prayer, but occupied the urgent space where those two things meet. They filled the night with human sound and directed it at the sky and at the sea, and the Bakunawa, disturbed, perhaps confused, perhaps simply reminded that it was not alone in this world, paused, hesitated, and the remaining moons were saved. This is the Bakunawa. This is where we begin, not with a monster in the simple sense of that word, not with a villain or a destroyer, but with a creature of genuine and staggering antiquity, born from one of the oldest and most sophisticated mythological traditions in Southeast Asia, embedded in the culture and the cosmology and the daily life of the Visayan peoples for generations beyond counting. A creature that explains the sky, a creature that explains the darkness, a creature that explains, most movingly of all, why human beings make noise together in the face of overwhelming things, why we drum and sing and raise our voices as one when the world goes dark and the silence becomes dangerous. The Bakunawa is not merely a story about a serpent, it is a story about what it means to be small in a large world, and to refuse, collectively and stubbornly and with everything you have, to be silent about it. That is where we begin, and there is much more still to come. To understand the Bakunawa, you must first understand the world it was born into, not the physical world. Though the physical world of the Philippine archipelago is extraordinary enough on its own terms, more than 7,000 islands scattered across a stretch of the western Pacific, like fragments of something enormous that broke apart before anyone arrived to see it whole, surrounded by some of the deepest ocean on the planet, shaped by volcanic fire and tropical rain into a landscape of almost implausible variety and beauty. That world is real, and it matters, because myths do not arise in a vacuum. They arise from the specific texture of the place where the people who tell them live, and the texture of the Philippine Islands, the intimacy with the sea, the visibility of the sky, the sense of being surrounded on all sides by enormous forces that do not require your permission to operate, is woven into the Bakunawa tradition at every level. But the world you must first understand is the mythological one, the one that existed in the Visayan telling before history began in its current form. The Visayan people are one of the major ethno-linguistic groups of the Philippine archipelago, inhabiting the central islands, Cebu, Bohol, Leyte, Samar, Negros, Panay, and the many smaller islands between and around them. Their mythological tradition is ancient and rich, and, for most of recorded history, was transmitted entirely through oral means, through the stories told by the Babalan, the spiritual leaders and ritual specialists who served as the keepers of cosmological knowledge, through the songs and chants that accompanied planting and fishing, and the major passages of human life, through the quiet inheritance of story from elder to child across generations too numerous to count. The arrival of Spanish colonization in the 16th century disrupted this transmission profoundly, and much was lost. What survived did so through the tenacity of oral tradition itself, and through the work of later ethnographers and scholars who gathered the remaining threads with varying degrees of care and completeness. What those threads reveal, when examined together, is a cosmological vision of considerable sophistication and beauty. In the beginning, the Visayan tradition tells us, there were three realms: the sky above, the earth in the middle, and the sea below. These were not merely physical locations, they were inhabited, governed, alive with beings whose natures and relationships shaped everything that happened in the world. The sky was the domain of the gods, Devourer and Bathala, divine beings of various orders and powers, some benevolent, some indifferent, some actively shaping the destinies of the people below. The earth was the human realm, though not exclusively human. The sea was something else, something older, something that did not submit to the same governance as the realms above it. The sea, in the Visayan mythological imagination, was not simply water. It was the first substance, the original condition of the world. Before the earth rose and the sky separated from it, was oceanic, a vast, undifferentiated deep from which everything else eventually emerged. The sea, therefore, had a primacy, a seniority, that even the gods acknowledged. It was the oldest thing, and the creatures that lived in its deepest places were correspondingly ancient, not created beings, in the way that later things were created, but things that had simply always been, the way the water itself had always been. The Bakunawa was one of these. But before the Bakunawa's story begins in earnest, the sky had to be populated, and in the Visayan tradition, it was populated lavishly, not with one moon and one sun, as the sky holds now, but with 7 moons. 7, in many of the world's oldest mythological systems, is not an arbitrary number. It is the number of completion, of fullness, of a thing that has been given everything it needs to be whole. 7 moons meant a sky that was never empty, never dark, never indifferent. The light was constant, the tides governed by moons, as the people of the sea-surrounded islands knew with intimate practical knowledge, were complex and layered and rich. The world, under 7 moons, was abundantly lit. This abundance is important. It is the condition the Bakunawa's hunger will disrupt. And like all mythological disruptions worth the name, it is not disrupted because something goes wrong, exactly, but because something inevitable arrives. The Bakunawa does not break the world. It simply grows hungry in it, the way any creature grows hungry, and acts accordingly. The accounts of the world before the serpent's rising are not long. They do not need to be. They establish, with the efficient economy of oral tradition, everything the listener needs to feel the weight of what comes next. The sky full of moons, the sea full of depth, the people on their islands between the two, living in a world where darkness was not yet the fundamental condition of the night, where the sky above the sea was silver and populous and generous, and beneath all of it, in the oldest water, something stirring. The Babalan who kept these stories understood that the world before disruption is not the world in its best state. It is the world in its unfinished state. The 7 moons are not paradise. They are a condition waiting to be tested, a fullness that has not yet discovered its limits. The Bakunawa does not ruin something perfect. It completes something incomplete. In swallowing the moons, it gives the world its night. In being driven back, partially, not fully, because some moons are gone forever and cannot be restored. It gives the world its moon, the one that remains, the one we have now. This is the mythological logic at work beneath the surface of the story, and it is worth pausing on because it is not the logic of a simple monster tale. Monster tales are about invasion, something from outside the proper order of things forcing its way in and needing to be expelled. The Bakunawa is not outside the proper order. It is an expression of it. It is the deep answering the bright, the old answering the new. The sea asserting its ancient primacy against a sky that had perhaps forgotten how much of the world lies beneath it. The people on the islands are not incidental to this story. They are, in a very real sense, its hinge point. The place where the two great forces meet and must be negotiated. They cannot control the sea. They cannot control the sky. What they can control is themselves. Their voices, their drums, their collective decision to not stand silent while the world loses its light. That decision, made in terror and in community on some ancient island shore while the moons went out one by one overhead, is the heart of the Bakunawa tradition. Everything else, the serpent's scale, the cosmological framework, the ritual practices that developed over centuries, orbits around that single human moment. The moment when people looked at something vast and frightening and chose, together, to make noise. The Bakunawa rose from the sea. This is the beginning of the active myth. The moment when the world that existed before, stable, luminous, governed by the 7 moons overhead, is interrupted by something that cannot be reasoned with and cannot be ignored. And the rising itself, as described across the various strands of the Visayan tradition, is not a moment of violence or catastrophe in the dramatic sense. It is something quieter than that. Something that in its quietness is more unsettling, more permanent feeling than any storm or eruption could be. The Bakunawa, in the oldest descriptions, does not announce itself. It simply appears. One moment the sea is the sea, present, enormous, doing what it has always done. And then, by degrees that resist precise accounting, there is something in it that was not there before. Or rather, something in it that has always been there is now closer to the surface. The water does not change its color. The waves do not alter their rhythm. The birds that rest on the ocean at night do not scatter. The rising of the Bakunawa is not visible in any of the ordinary ways that large things moving through water are visible. It is felt, instead, in the air, in the particular quality of the silence over the water, in the way the light from the 7 moons, striking the sea's surface, seems to penetrate less deeply than it did before, as if something beneath the surface is absorbing it rather than letting it pass through. The physical descriptions of the Bakunawa itself, gathered from the oral tradition across multiple Visayan communities and preserved in varying states of completeness, are consistent in their broad strokes while differing beautifully in their details, which is exactly what you expect from a living oral tradition, one that has been told and retold across generations and islands and circumstances, accumulating variation the way a river accumulates tributaries. The creature is, in all accounts, immense. The word that comes up again and again in descriptions, in various Visayan languages, carries a meaning closer to world-sized than simply very large. It is not a creature that exists within the landscape, the way that even the largest natural animals exist within it, as inhabitants, as beings whose scale, however impressive, is still legible against the background of sea and sky. The Bakunawa is not legible in that way. It is more like a feature of the landscape, a geographic fact. When it is present the way a deep ocean trench is present, as a structural reality of the world, rather than a thing moving through it. It is a serpent. This all traditions agree upon clearly and consistently. Its body is long and sinuous and scaled, moving through the water with the particular fluid efficiency of serpentine motion, which is to say, without apparent effort, without the thrashing and displacement that a creature of comparable size moving differently would produce. It passes through the water, the way the water passes through itself, following the path of least resistance, finding the natural channels, leaving the surface above it relatively undisturbed. This is part of what makes it so difficult to detect in the tradition's account of its rising. A creature that moves like a current is a creature that is easy to mistake, for one. Its scales are described variously as dark green, as black, as the particular color of deep water when you look down into it from a boat on a clear day. That color that is neither blue nor green nor black, but somehow all three simultaneously. The color of depth itself rather than any surface. Some accounts describe the scales as iridescent, catching the moonlight and returning it changed, in colors that should not exist, the way abalone shell returns light in colors. The shell itself does not contain. Others describe them as entirely non-reflective, absorbing the light of the 7 moons without giving any of it back, so that the Bakunawa's body, where it can be seen at all, appears as a subtraction from the world rather than an addition to it, a shape defined not by what it is, but by what it removes from the background. The head is described with the consistency that the most important details always attract in oral tradition, because the head is what eats the moons, and the eating is the central act, and the head must therefore be described accurately, must be passed down intact, must not be allowed to blur into vagueness the way peripheral details are permitted to blur. The head is enormous and flat-profiled, broader than it is tall, giving the creature a silhouette when seen against the moonlit sky that is simultaneously serpentine and strangely architectural, less like an animal's head and more like the prow of something, a leading edge built for the purpose of meeting whatever lies ahead of it. The mouth, when it opens opens wide, very wide, wide in a way that the tradition strains to express in language, because the reference points available, the widest things a person from an island fishing community would know, the widest nets, the widest bays, the widest spans of horizon visible from the highest point of the highest island, are not wide enough. What does the Bakunawa want? This question sits at the center of the myth's theological interest, and the tradition's answer is more nuanced than a simple recounting of the events would suggest. The Bakunawa swallows the moons. That is factual, within the myth's own terms. But why it swallows them is a matter that different traditions and different tellings handle with different emphases, and the variation is meaningful. The most straightforward reading, and perhaps the most ancient, is simply that the Bakunawa is drawn to the light, that the 7 moons, blazing above the sea that is the creature's home and world, represent something irresistible to it. Not food exactly, not sustenance in the ordinary biological sense, but an attraction that operates at a level below reason and choice. The Bakunawa rises toward the moons, the way any creature moves toward the thing that compels it most fundamentally. It does not decide to swallow a moon any more than a deep-sea creature decides to move toward the one point of light in the darkness around it. The movement is prior to decision. It is what the creature is. Other tellings add a layer of what might be called grievance, a sense that the Bakunawa, in its immense antiquity, had existed in a world where the balance between the deep and the light was different, and that the 7 moons represented an excess, a tipping of that balance too far toward brightness, toward the exposure of the deep, toward the reduction of the private and ancient dark that the sea required in order to be fully itself. In these readings, the Bakunawa's hunger is not random appetite, but a corrective impulse. The sea asserting, through its oldest inhabitant, that the world has been made too bright and must be adjusted. And then there are the tellings, quieter, stranger, harder to categorize, in which the Bakunawa's motivation is something close to loneliness. A creature of that age, of that scale, of that depth, the only one of its kind in a world populated by beings so much smaller as to be practically invisible from its perspective. Such a creature, these tellings suggest, might rise toward the moons, not to consume them, but to be near them, to be close, for a moment, to something else that was large enough to be felt, and that the swallowing was, in some sense, an accident of scale. The creature coming too close to something it desired, and the mouth being what mouths are, and the moon being what the moon is, and the two facts combining in the only way they could. This reading is the saddest of the 3, and perhaps the one that has stayed longest in the imagination of the people who received it, because it transforms the Bakunawa from a monster into something far more complicated, a being of immense power and immense isolation, reaching toward the light, not from malice but from need, and finding that its own nature made the reaching itself destructive. Whatever its motivation, the result was the same. The moons began to disappear, one by one, across a period of time the tradition does not specify precisely, because the tradition is not interested in chronology so much as experience, in how the loss of the moons felt, rather than how long it took. The sky above the Philippine Sea was diminished. The light that had made the world continuously bright became something else, became intermittent, became precious, became, for the first time, the kind of thing that could be lost. And the people on the islands, watching the sky change above them, felt something they had never felt before. They felt the dark coming. There is a moment in every great myth where the human beings in the story must decide what to do. Not the gods, not the cosmic forces, not the ancient creature rising from the sea toward the sky. The people, the ordinary people, standing on the shore, or in their homes, or on the water in their boats, watching something happen that is entirely beyond their power to prevent, and faced with the most fundamental question that crisis ever asks. What do you do when the thing happening is too large for you? The Bakunawa tradition's answer to this question is one of the most quietly extraordinary things about it, because the answer is not a hero. It is not a god intervening on humanity's behalf. It is not a weapon or a stratagem or a sacrifice of the kind that other mythological traditions reach for when the monster arrives and the world needs saving. The Bakunawa tradition's answer is simpler and, in its simplicity, far more interesting. The answer is noise. Collective, sustained, fully committed human noise. The tradition is specific about this in a way that matters. When the people of the island saw the moons disappearing, one gone, then a second, then a third, the sky growing darker with each loss, the sea below reflecting less and less light, the world contracting around them toward a darkness they had never known, they did not scatter, they did not hide, they gathered. Community by community, island by island, they came together in the way that the Visayan social structure, organized around the barangay, the fundamental community unit, enabled them to come together, quickly, with shared purpose, drawing on relationships and obligations, and the deep familiarity of people who have lived alongside each other for their entire lives. And they made noise. They beat their caldero, their pots, their cooking vessels, the metal and clay containers of their domestic lives, against anything that would make a sound. They struck drums. They clashed whatever they had that could be clashed. They raised their voices in a collective shout that was not a word and not a song, but something prior to both, something that the body produces when it is frightened and determined simultaneously and has decided that silence is not an option. The noise they made was enormous. It was the noise of an entire people refusing, together, to accept what was happening quietly. And the Bakunawa, the tradition tells us, was disturbed by it. This is the mythological pivot around which everything turns, and it is worth examining carefully because it tells us something important about how the Visayan tradition understood the relationship between human beings and cosmic forces. The Bakunawa is not defeated by the noise. It is not harmed by it. It does not flee in terror. It is disturbed, confused perhaps, or distracted, or simply made aware in a way it had not previously been aware that the world it was moving through was inhabited, that the light it was consuming had meaning to the creatures who lived beneath it, that its hunger was not occurring in an empty universe, but in one full of small, noisy, insistent presences that were not willing to simply accept the dark. The Bakunawa pauses. It looks, if looking is the right word for what something of that scale and that nature does when it redirects its attention, at the islands and the people on them. And in that pause, the remaining moons, or the one remaining moon, have the opportunity to move, to shift position, to go below the horizon where the Bakunawa cannot easily reach. The world is saved. Partially. 3 moons are gone, or 4, or 5, or 6, depending on which version of the tradition you follow. The precise number varies between accounts, reflecting the genuine diversity of a living oral tradition rather than any confusion or error. What is consistent across all versions is the essential shape of the outcome. Some moons are lost forever. The age of abundant light does not return, but one moon remains, the one we have now, hanging in the sky over the Philippine Sea as it has hung there since the morning after the Bakunawa was first disturbed by the noise of the people below. One moon is enough. It is what we were left with, and it is what we have learned to navigate by. The ritual practice that developed from this mythological moment is one of the most tangible and enduring legacies of the Bakunawa tradition. Across the Visayan Islands and into other Philippine communities where the serpent story had traveled, lunar eclipses, the periodic darkening of the single remaining moon, were understood as the Bakunawa returning, trying again, swallowing once more the light it had always been drawn to. And the appropriate response was the same as it had always been: noise. During lunar eclipses, Visayan communities would do precisely what their ancestors had done when the original moons were being swallowed. They would beat pots and pans. They would strike drums. They would shout and sing and make every sound available to them. The collective noise of the community directed at the sky, at the sea, at the Bakunawa moving in the deep. The practice was not ceremonial in the distant, abstract way that some ritual practices become ceremonial over time, drained of their original urgency and preserved as form without feeling. It was immediate. It was urgent. The people making noise during an eclipse were not commemorating something their ancestors had done. They were doing it again. The Bakunawa was present now, feeding now, and the noise was needed now, for the same reason it had always been needed. This directness, this practical immediacy of the ritual, is one of the things that makes the Bakunawa tradition so vivid and so human. It does not ask you to believe in something invisible, or to perform a ceremony whose effects are metaphorical. It asks you to participate in something concrete. The moon is disappearing. The serpent is swallowing it. Make noise to stop it. The causal chain is clear. The required action is clear. The result, the moon returning, is visible, measurable, immediate. The ritual works every time in the most obvious possible sense. The moon always comes back. The Babalan, the spiritual leaders who served as the keepers of sacred knowledge and the conductors of ritual life in the Saiyan communities, played a specific role in the eclipse ceremonies that went beyond simply joining the noise. They were the ones who understood the Bakunawa tradition in its full cosmological depth, who could read the signs of the serpent's approach, who knew the specific invocations and the specific rhythms that were most effective at disturbing the creature's feeding. Their knowledge was not separate from the community's knowledge, but was a deeper version of it. The same story, the same tradition, understood from a position of greater training and greater responsibility. The Babalan tradition is itself one of the most significant aspects of Visayan culture, and it intersects with the Bakunawa myth in ways that reward attention. The Babalan were frequently women, or men who occupied a gender role that the Visayan world understood as distinct from the ordinary male social position, a fact that made them, in many communities, the primary custodians of the most sacred knowledge. To be a Babalan was to stand at the intersection of the human and the divine, to be the person through whom the community's relationship with the larger forces of the world was managed and maintained. The Bakunawa, as the largest and most ancient of those forces, was accordingly one of their most important areas of expertise. What they knew about the Bakunawa went deeper than the story as most people knew it. They knew its moods, in the way that the tradition's long attention to the creature's behavior had produced a kind of accumulated knowledge about when it was most likely to stir, what conditions in the sea and sky suggested its presence, how different phases of the lunar cycle corresponded to different degrees of the creature's restlessness. This knowledge was practical in the most direct sense. It helped communities prepare, helped them know when to have their pots and drums ready, helped them understand the eclipse not as a sudden crisis but as a predictable event with a predictable shape and a predictable resolution. The Bakunawa fed, the people made noise, the moon returned, every time. This is the mythological contract at the heart of the tradition, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because it is so different from the contracts at the heart of most other mythological traditions involving monstrous creatures. In those traditions, the monster must ultimately be destroyed. The dragon must be slain. The sea creature must be driven permanently back. The hero must triumph conclusively, and the threat must be ended rather than managed. The Bakunawa tradition does not offer this. The Bakunawa is never destroyed. It is not imprisoned. It is not permanently defeated. It is disturbed temporarily from its feeding, and it descends back into the deep, and it will return, and the people will need to make their noise again. The tradition does not present this as a failure. It presents it as the nature of things. The serpent is older than the people. It is larger than the people. It will outlast the people. The correct relationship with something of that nature is not conquest. It is the ongoing, renewable, communal act of insisting on your own presence, of making enough noise that even the oldest and largest thing in the world cannot entirely ignore you. The moon comes back, not because the Bakunawa is defeated, but because the people are loud. There is a philosophy in that, a genuinely profound one, and it has been practiced on the islands of the Philippine Sea for longer than anyone can say. The Philippine archipelago is not one place. This seems like an obvious statement, but its implications for the study of Philippine mythology are profound and frequently underappreciated. 7,000 islands spread across a stretch of ocean that spans roughly the same north to south distance as the continental United States, inhabited by hundreds of ethno-linguistic groups speaking languages as distinct from one another as Spanish is from Romanian, languages that share common ancestry, but have diverged over centuries of relative island isolation into genuinely separate systems of sound and grammar and meaning. The cultural traditions of the Igorot peoples of northern Luzon and the Tausug people of the Sulu archipelago and the Visayan peoples of the Central Islands are related in deep historical ways, but they are also genuinely, significantly different. They are not variations on a single Philippine culture. They are distinct cultures that share a common origin, the way cousins share grandparents, recognizably kin, but separately themselves. The Bakunawa, in this context, is remarkable, because the great moon-swallowing serpent is not exclusively Visayan. Versions of the creature, carrying its essential characteristics, the immense scale, the serpentine form, the appetite for celestial bodies, the role in explaining eclipses, appear in mythological traditions across the archipelago, in communities separated by hundreds of miles of open water, speaking languages that are mutually unintelligible, organized around social and ritual systems that differ in significant ways. The Bakunawa has traveled, or has arisen independently in multiple places, or, most likely, represents a tradition so ancient that it predates the divergence of the cultures that now claim versions of it. A story carried outward from a common origin as the peoples of the archipelago spread and separated and became, over millennia, the distinct communities they are today. In the Bicolano tradition of the Bicol region in southern Luzon, there is a creature called the Bakunawa as well, the name preserved across the linguistic boundary, whose story shares the essential eclipse mythology with the Visayan version, while adding details and emphases that reflect the specific cultural context of the Bicolano people. The Bicolano Bakunawa is explicitly described in some accounts as a creature that was once something else, that underwent a transformation, a becoming, rather than simply always having been what it is. This transformative quality, rare in the Visayan accounts, gives the Bicolano version a slightly different emotional texture. The serpent is fearsome, but it is also, in some sense, a fallen thing, a creature that arrived at its current nature through a process that implies the possibility of change in a way that the eternal, unchanging Bakunawa of the Visayan tradition does not quite suggest. In the traditions of the Bagobo people of Mindanao, the great serpent mythology takes a form that emphasizes the creature's relationship to the underworld as much as to the sea. The Bagobo cosmos is organized around a layered structure of upper and lower worlds, and the serpent figure in their tradition moves not only horizontally through the ocean but vertically through the layers of the world, capable of ascending from the lowest realm to the highest, of passing through the human world and the world above it in its pursuit of the light. This vertical mobility gives the Mindanao serpent a quality of omnipresence, of potential presence in any layer of reality that is somewhat different from the primarily oceanic character of the Visayan Bakunawa. It is a creature not just of the deep sea, but of the deep world, the bottom of everything, wherever everything has a bottom. The Maranao people, also of Mindanao, have their own tradition of a great serpent associated with water and with the disruption of celestial order. though their version carries the specific cultural and religious inflections of a community with significant Islamic influence layered over much older animist foundations. Tracing the Bakunawa through the Maranao tradition requires disentangling threads that have been woven together over centuries, distinguishing the indigenous serpent mythology from the Naga traditions that came with Hindu and Buddhist influence from the West, from the jinn and cosmic serpent imagery of the Islamic tradition, and finding beneath all of these later additions the older shape of the creature that was here before any of them arrived. This layering, indigenous serpent myth beneath Hindu Naga, influence beneath Islamic cosmological imagery, is one of the most fascinating aspects of Philippine mythological history, and one of the least understood. The Philippine archipelago sits at the intersection of some of the most significant cultural exchange routes in human history. Indian cultural influence arrived early, via trade, and the spread of Indianized kingdoms across Southeast Asia. Islam arrived in the 14th and 15th centuries, spreading through the southern islands with remarkable speed. Spanish Christianity arrived in the 16th century and transformed, with varying degrees of thoroughness, the religious life of most of the archipelago. Each of these arrivals brought its own serpent traditions, its own cosmic dragon mythologies, its own frameworks for understanding the relationship between serpentine creatures and celestial events. The Bakunawa survived all of them, not unchanged. The tradition absorbed influences, incorporated new imagery, acquired new names in some communities, and new narrative details in others. But the essential creature, the great serpent of the deep sea, the eater of moons, the thing that must be met with collective human noise, persisted through every wave of cultural transformation, finding accommodation with each new cosmological system it encountered while maintaining its fundamental identity. The relationship between the Bakunawa and the Hindu Naga tradition is particularly worth considering. The Naga, the great cosmic serpent of Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, associated with water and with the underworld, and with the complex interplay between divine and chthonic forces, was introduced to the Philippine archipelago through the same Indianized trade networks that brought Sanskrit loanwords into Tagalog and Visayan and other Philippine languages, that brought certain artistic conventions and social structures and ritual practices that are still traceable in Philippine culture today. The Naga and the Bakunawa have obvious surface similarities. Both are enormous serpents. Both are associated with water. Both have cosmological significance that goes well beyond the merely natural. But they are not the same creature. The Naga operates within a specifically Hindu or Buddhist theological framework, with a defined relationship to the gods, to the cosmic order, to the cycle of creation and destruction that those traditions describe. The Bakunawa predates this framework in the Philippine context. It was here before the Naga arrived, and it remained itself after the Naga's arrival, even when communities that received both traditions began, inevitably, to find correspondences between them and to allow them to influence each other's shape in the telling. What the Naga influence contributed to the Bakunawa tradition in some communities was an expanded sense of the creature's cosmic significance, a positioning of the Bakunawa not just as a feature of local Philippine cosmology, but as a participant in the larger drama of cosmic order and chaos that Hindu and Buddhist thought described in such elaborate and influential detail. This enriched the tradition without replacing it. The Bakunawa remained the Bakunawa, the specific, local, sea-born, moon-eating serpent of the Philippine Islands, while acquiring, in some of its tellings, a resonance with the larger framework of South and Southeast Asian cosmic mythology. It is also worth noting, in the context of the tradition's vitality and breadth, that the Bakunawa is not merely preserved in the oral tradition and in the records of ethnographers. It has a living presence in Philippine culture that extends into the present day, in contemporary literature and art, in films and comics and graphic novels, in the work of Filipino creators who have grown up with the Bakunawa story and return to it repeatedly as a resource, as an image, as a way of thinking about Philippine identity, and the relationship between indigenous tradition and contemporary life. The Bakunawa appears in the visual art of painters who render it with a specificity and a beauty that the oral tradition's language descriptions can only approximate, who work out, in paint and line and color, what those scales actually look like, how that head actually sits in relation to that body, how the moon looks inside that mouth. It appears in fiction, in stories that take the mythological framework and ask new questions of it. What does the Bakunawa dream about between feedings? What does it feel when the noise begins, and it must release what it has taken? It appears in music, in the compositions of Filipino musicians who hear in the Bakunawa tradition a rhythm and a drama that translates naturally into sound. This living presence is not a mere curiosity. It is evidence of what the tradition has always been, not a relic, not an artifact to be studied from a comfortable distance, but a living way of understanding the world that continues to generate meaning for the people who inherit it. The Bakunawa is not a creature of the past. It is a creature of the Philippine Sea, which is still there, of the Philippine sky, which still holds its one remaining moon, of the Filipino imagination, which is still large enough to hold something ancient and enormous and not entirely understood, and to find in that enormity not only fear, but something else. Something that sounds, if you listen carefully, like drums. We have followed the Bakunawa from its origins in the deep sea of Visayan mythology. Through the night it rose to swallow the 7 moons, through the response of the people on the islands, through its travels across the Philippine archipelago, and the layers of cultural influence it has absorbed and survived. We have traced its body across traditions and centuries, and the crossing of linguistic boundaries. We have seen what it looks like, or as close to what it looks like as the tradition's deliberate and beautiful imprecision will allow. Now we must ask the question that all of this has been building toward. What does it mean? Not in the simple sense, not the astronomical meaning, the eclipse explained. The moon's periodic darkening accounted for by the narrative of the serpent's hunger. That is the myth's surface function, and it is a real function, but it is not the most important one. The most important thing about the Bakunawa tradition is not that it explains an eclipse. It is what it says about how human beings should relate to the things in the world that are far beyond their power to control. Begin with the structure of the myth itself, because the structure is the argument. In most mythological traditions that involve a monstrous creature threatening the world, the resolution comes from above. A god acts. A hero of divine or semi-divine origin arrives, armed with exceptional power and exceptional weapons, and defeats the creature, and the world is restored. The human beings in the story are largely passive. They are the ones being protected, the ones whose suffering gives the hero a reason to act, the ones who benefit from a victory they did not themselves achieve. This is not a criticism of those traditions. They are beautiful and meaningful in their own ways, and they speak to real human experiences of helplessness and the longing for rescue. But they position human beings in a specific relationship to cosmic power, as recipients of divine intervention, as protected children rather than participants in their own salvation. The Bakunawa tradition does something fundamentally different. There is no hero in the Bakunawa story. There is no god who comes to fight the serpent on humanity's behalf. There is no divine weapon forged for the occasion, no champion who rises to meet the creature in single combat and prevails through exceptional virtue or exceptional strength. There is only the community, ordinary people, on their ordinary islands, with their ordinary pots and pans and drums and voices, deciding together that they will not be quiet while the world goes dark. And it works. Not because the Bakunawa is weak. The tradition is at great pains to establish that the Bakunawa is not weak. It is ancient and enormous and indifferent to human concerns in the most fundamental way, that very old and very large things are indifferent, not through malice but through a scale of existence at which human beings barely register. The noise the people make does not injure it. It does not frighten it in the way that a smaller creature might be frightened by a sound. It associates with danger. It disturbs it. It interrupts the quality of its attention. It introduces into the creature's experience of the moment something that was not there before. The presence, the undeniable, audible presence of the human community insisting on being acknowledged. This is the philosophical heart of the tradition, and it is worth stating clearly. The Bakunawa myth argues that collective human presence, collectively and loudly asserted, has the power to change the behavior of forces that no individual human being could influence or resist. The individual standing alone on the shore, shouting at the serpent, would accomplish nothing. The community, making noise together with the full commitment of everyone who has pots to bang and a voice to raise. That community achieves something. Not the defeat of the serpent, not the restoration of all 7 moons, but the preservation of the one moon that matters most, the one that lights the way home across the water. This is not a naive argument. It does not claim that human beings can, through sufficient collective effort, overcome everything. The lost moons are genuinely lost. The tradition does not pretend otherwise. It does not offer a false comfort that says the darkness can be fully held back, that nothing will ever be permanently taken. Some things are gone and do not return. This is true, and the tradition acknowledges it honestly, without flinching. But within that honest acknowledgement of permanent loss, there is the equally honest insistence that not everything needs to be lost, that the last moon, the one remaining, can be preserved, can be called back from the serpent's mouth, can be restored to the sky where it belongs, if the people make noise. The communal dimension of this philosophy cannot be overstated. The Bakunawa tradition is not about individual heroism or individual resistance. It is about bayanihan, the deep Filipino value of communal unity and mutual aid, of the community as the primary unit of resilience rather than the individual. The noise that saves the moon is not one person's noise. It is everyone's noise. It requires every voice, every pair of hands, every drum and pot and instrument of sound that the community possesses. A community in which some people participate and others stand aside is a community that is less loud than it needs to be, and the serpent will not be disturbed, and the moon will not return. The eclipse ritual, in this light, is not merely a religious practice. It is a rehearsal of the community's capacity to act together under pressure. Every time the people gathered and made their noise and watched the moon return, they were not only fulfilling a mythological obligation, they were practicing being a community. They were strengthening the social muscle that collective action requires. The ability to set aside ordinary disputes and ordinary separateness and ordinary individual concerns in order to do something together, loudly, with full commitment, for the sake of something larger than any one of them. The Babalan understood this. Their role in the eclipse ceremonies was not simply to perform the correct rituals. It was to organize the community's energy, to channel the noise into its most effective form, to ensure that what the people produced was genuine collective action, rather than a collection of individual noises that happened to occur at the same time. The difference matters. The tradition knew it mattered. There is something else the Bakunawa tradition contains that becomes most visible in the context of the Philippines' long history of colonial experience. The Spanish arrived in the 16th century and found a people whose cosmology was organized, in part, around a great serpent that could only be resisted through collective noise. They found people whose ritual life included, as one of its central practices, the communal refusal to be silent in the face of overwhelming force. They found people who had been practicing, for centuries or millennia, the skill of gathering together and making noise when something enormous threatened to take the light. The Spanish colonial project attempted, with considerable thoroughness, to replace this cosmology with Christianity, to substitute the Bakunawa and the seven moons in the Babylon and the noise with a different story, a different set of rituals, a different relationship between the human and the cosmic, and to a significant degree, they succeeded. The old traditions were suppressed, the Babylon were persecuted, the eclipse ceremonies were discouraged or forbidden. Much was lost, but the Bakunawa survived. It survived in the ways that things survive when they are driven underground, in fragments, in the private transmission between generations within families, in the cultural memory encoded in practices that continued even when their original meaning was obscured. It survived because the story was too useful to lose, too accurate in its mythological way, to be replaced by something less true to the actual experience of living in these islands, in this sea, under this sky. And when, in the 19th and 20th centuries, Filipino scholars and writers and artists began the long work of recovering indigenous traditions, began asking their grandparents and great-grandparents what they remembered, began combing through colonial-era records for the traces of what had been recorded before it was suppressed, began treating the mythological tradition not as superstition to be overcome, but as knowledge to be recovered, the Bakunawa was one of the things they found, battered, fragmented, changed by centuries of pressure, but recognizable. Still itself, still the great serpent of the Philippine Sea, still the eater of moons, still the creature that could only be answered by the collective noise of the people. In the context of a people who had spent 300 years under Spanish colonial rule, and then decades under American colonial rule, and then the brutal years of Japanese occupation, and then the long struggle of independence, and the ongoing work of building a nation from an archipelago of extraordinary diversity. In that context, the Bakunawa tradition carries a charge that goes beyond mythology. It is a story about what you do when something immense and powerful and indifferent to your existence is taking the light, and the answer it gives. Gather, make noise, refuse to be silent, do it together, is not a mythological answer only, it is also a political one, a social one, a deeply, enduringly human one. The moon returns when the people make noise. It has always returned, through every eclipse, every colonial suppression, every attempt to replace the old story with a new one, every generation that had to rediscover for itself what the generation before it had known. The moon has returned. The serpent has always, eventually, let it go. And the people have always, eventually, remembered to be loud. The Bakunawa is still down there. This is not a statement that requires belief in the literal existence of a cosmic sea serpent to be true in the way that matters. It is a statement about the persistence of what the Bakunawa represents. The deep, the dark, the ancient hunger that rises periodically toward the light and must be met. Every time it rises with the same collective refusal to be silenced. The Bakunawa does not retire. It does not evolve into something smaller or something more manageable. It remains what it has always been, the oldest thing in the deepest water, patient beyond any human measure of patience, drawn to the light with a consistency that makes it, in a perverse way, the most reliable thing in the world. You can set a calendar by it. The people of the islands did. The tradition that produced the Bakunawa is not a dead tradition. This bears repeating, because there is a tendency, particularly in the way that Western scholarship has sometimes framed the study of indigenous mythology, to speak of these traditions in the past tense, to treat them as artifacts of something that no longer quite exists, preserved, and significant, but finished. The Bakunawa is not finished. Filipino writers are writing it. Filipino artists are painting it. Filipino filmmakers are filming it. Filipino children are growing up hearing some version of it, in some form, whether from a grandparent or a classroom, or a graphic novel, or a cultural festival that has chosen to make the recovery of indigenous tradition one of its purposes. The tradition is not what it was. It cannot be. 300 years of colonial suppression and the radical transformation of Philippine society across every dimension of life have changed what it means to carry the Bakunawa story, have changed what forms the carrying takes, have changed what questions the story is being asked to answer. The Babalan no longer serve in most communities the role they once served. The eclipse ceremonies no longer unfold in the form they once took. The cosmological framework that gave the Bakunawa its original theological context has been, for most Filipinos, replaced by a Christian one that does not have an obvious place for moon-eating sea serpents. And yet the Bakunawa persists, because the questions it answers are not questions that Christianity, or science, or any other system that has arrived in the Philippine Islands since the Babaylan's time has rendered obsolete. They are the oldest questions, the ones that belong to any people who have ever lived beside the sea and looked up at the sky and felt the particular smallness that comes from understanding, really understanding, how large the world is and how brief the light. What do you do when the darkness comes? What do you do when the thing taking the light is too large to fight? What do you do when you are small and the world is enormous and the ancient hunger has risen again and the moon is disappearing? The Bakunawa tradition's answer, refined across centuries of practice and preserved through every attempt to replace it with something else, is the same answer it has always been. You gather. You bring your pots and your drums and your voices and your willingness to be loud in the dark. You find the people on either side of you, and you make sure they are making noise too. You fill the night with the sound of your presence. Not a prayer exactly, not a battle cry exactly, but something that contains elements of both. Something that says simultaneously, I know you are there, and I am here. And I am not going to be quiet about it. And the moon comes back. It always comes back, not because the world is safe or because the serpent has been defeated or because the darkness has been permanently solved. The world is not safe. The serpent has not been defeated. The darkness has not been solved. These facts are as true now as they were when the first Babaylan first told the first version of this story on the shore of an island in the Philippine Sea, watching the moons go out one by one and understanding, with the calm clarity that true wisdom sometimes produces, what the situation required. The moon comes back because the people made noise, because they gathered in their fear and their determination and their refusal to accept the dark quietly. And they filled the night with the sound of a community that has decided it is still here, still present, still unwilling to be forgotten by the oldest thing in the water. The Bakunawa descends, it always descends, back into the deep that is its home, back into the dark that is its nature, back into the patience that allows it to wait for the next eclipse, the next opportunity, the next time the moon comes close enough, and the people perhaps grow quiet enough that the feeding might proceed uninterrupted. It is down there now. The Philippine Sea is deep, deeper than most seas. The Mariana Trench, the deepest point on the surface of the earth, is less than 500 miles from the eastern coast of the Philippine archipelago, a fact that the geologically sophisticated ancestors of the Visayan people did not know in those terms, but whose truth they felt in the quality of the water around them, in the way the sea dropped away so quickly from the island shores, in the sense that the ocean near these islands was not merely very deep, but was deep in a specific and absolute way, deep all the way down to whatever is at the bottom of everything. Whatever is at the bottom of everything. Somewhere in that depth, patient and enormous and unreflective, the Bakunawa waits for the next eclipse. And somewhere on the islands above it, people are still alive who know what their grandparents knew, who have heard some version of the story, who carry in their cultural memory, however faintly, however incompletely, the knowledge of what to do when the moon starts to go dark. Get loud, get together and get loud. The serpent cannot hold the moon and listen at the same time. It never could.